Aita for telling my husband he's destroying our family by chasing a job on the other side of the country when he accepted the position in Seattle without even mentioning the interview to me or our 3 kids. He casually brought it up over Tuesday night tacos, saying we had 6 weeks to pack up our entire life in Ohio, like he was discussing a weekend trip. I looked at our children, Emma, 14, Lucas, 11, and Sophie, 8, frozen mid-bite, and something inside me shifted. While David rambled about career opportunities and fresh starts, I smiled, set down my fork, and said the words that would change everything. "That sounds wonderful, honey. I'll start packing right away." The confusion on his face was delicious. He'd expected tears, arguments, the usual pattern of our disagreements where I eventually gave in after he wore me down. Instead, I reached across the table, squeezed his hand warmly, and asked about the moving timeline. Our daughter Emma's eyes met mine with a question I couldn't answer yet, but I gave her the slightest shake of my head. "Trust me," that look said. David, so relieved to avoid conflict, launched into details about his new salary, the tech company, the incredible opportunity he couldn't pass up. What he didn't know was that I'd already made my own decision, one that would teach him exactly what happens when you treat your family like chess pieces to be moved at will. I met David 15 years ago when we were both working at a marketing firm in Cleveland. He was ambitious, confident, and had a way of making me feel like we were building something together. For the first few years, we were partners in every sense, discussing career moves, supporting each other's goals, making decisions as a team. I'd put my own career on hold when Emma was born, then again with Lucas, and finally with Sophie. Each time, we'd agreed it made sense financially, and David promised we'd revisit my career once the kids were older. That revisiting never came. Instead, I became the manager of our household, the scheduler, the homework helper, the one who remembered dentist appointments and permission slips while David climbed the corporate ladder. I told myself it was temporary, that partnership would return. Tuesday night proved I'd been lying to myself for years. The morning after his announcement, I drove the kids to school in silence. Emma, perceptive as always, finally asked from the back seat, "Mom, are we really moving to Seattle?" I glanced in the rearview mirror at her worried face, at Lucas staring out the window, at Sophie clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Your father is moving to Seattle," I said carefully. "We're staying exactly where we are." Emma's eyes widened. "Does Dad know that?" I smiled. "Not yet, sweetheart. Not yet." That afternoon, while David was at work, I made 3 phone calls that would reshape our future. The first was to Jennifer Novak, the divorce attorney whose card I'd kept hidden in my desk drawer for 2 years, ever since David's last unilateral decision to invest our savings in his friend's startup without consulting me. The second was to Dr. Patricia Hayes, our marriage counselor from 3 years ago, requesting all our session notes where David's pattern of decision-making without input was documented. The third was to my old boss at the marketing firm, asking if that director position she'd mentioned last year was still available. All 3 conversations ended better than I'd hoped. David came home that evening energized, talking about schools in Seattle, neighborhoods, housing prices. I listened, nodded, asked thoughtful questions about commute times and office culture. When he pulled up Zillow to show me condos we might be able to afford, I noticed they were all 1-bedrooms or studios. "These are pretty small," I observed casually. He barely looked up. "Yeah, I'll probably need to stay in temporary housing for a few months while you guys finish out the school year, sell the house, that kind of thing." There it was. The assumption that we'd follow, that I'd uproot our children's lives, leave my aging parents, abandon the community we'd built, all to trail behind his ambition. "That makes sense," I said sweetly. "Very practical." Over the next 2 weeks, I became the model supportive wife. I researched Seattle neighborhoods, printed information about schools, even created a spreadsheet comparing our cost of living in Ohio versus Washington. David was so pleased with my attitude adjustment that he barely noticed I was also meeting with attorney Novak twice a week, documenting every financial record, every email where I'd expressed concerns about his unilateral decisions, every text message showing the pattern of behavior that had led to this moment. What David saw as compliance was actually preparation. I was building a case that would ensure our children's stability while he pursued his dreams alone. Jennifer Novak was sharp, efficient, and had seen cases like mine before. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, she explained during our second meeting. Given that you've been the primary caregiver for 15 years, put your career on hold for the family, and he's making unilateral decisions about relocation, we have a strong case for you maintaining the marital home with the children. She leaned forward, her expression serious. But Rebecca, the key is timing. If you let him establish residency in Seattle while you're still here, it strengthens your argument that he abandoned the family home. If you move with him, then decide to divorce, it becomes more complicated. I understood perfectly. David needed to go to Seattle alone, believing we'd follow, while I quietly dismantled the life he'd taken for granted. The hardest part was maintaining the facade with the kids. Emma had figured out something was happening, her teenage intuition sharp enough to read between my carefully chosen words. One evening, she found me in my home office, reviewing financial statements Jennifer had requested. "Mom, you're divorcing Dad, aren't you?" she asked quietly, closing the door behind her. I looked at my daughter, so much wiser than her 14 years, and decided she deserved the truth. "Your father made a major life decision without considering any of us," I said carefully. "He assumed we'd just follow along because that's what's always happened. But Emma, you have friends here, activities, a life you've built. Lucas has his robotics team. Sophie has her best friend next door. I have my parents 10 minutes away and a job opportunity I'm actually excited about. Should all of that be erased because your father wants a new adventure?" Emma sat down across from me, processing. "But families are supposed to stay together." Her voice wavered, and I saw the conflict in her eyes, the desire to take sides warring with her love for both parents. "Families stay together when all the members respect each other enough to make decisions together," I replied gently. "Your father loves you all very much, but he's forgotten how to be a partner. Sometimes people need to learn that lesson the hard way." She was quiet for a long moment. "Will we still see him?" "Of course," I assured her. "He'll always be your father. But he'll learn to be a father from Seattle, and we'll build our life here. You can visit during summers, holidays. He'll come back for your important events. It'll be different, but different isn't always bad." 3 weeks after the Taco Tuesday announcement, David's excitement was reaching fever pitch. He'd rented a furnished apartment in Seattle, arranged for movers to transport his clothes and personal items, and booked his flight for the following Monday. "The company's paying for temporary housing for 3 months, he told me proudly. "That should give you plenty of time to sell the house and get the kids ready to move." I was folding his laundry, playing the dutiful wife one last time. 3 months seems tight, I said, especially with Emma finishing her freshman year. "What if we needed longer?" He waved off my concern. "You're great at this stuff, Becca. You'll figure it out." That casual dismissal of 15 years of household management, of emotional labor, of keeping our family's life running smoothly while he focused on his career, was almost enough to make me reveal my hand early. Almost. Saturday morning, 2 days before his Monday flight, I made breakfast for the family one last time as a complete unit. David was glued to his phone, texting with his new colleagues, barely noticing Lucas trying to show him a robot he'd built. Sophie kept asking when they'd move, and David kept giving vague, soon, answers without looking at her. Emma caught my eye across the table, and I gave her a small nod. After breakfast, while David packed his bags in our bedroom, I gathered the kids in the living room. "I need you 3 to be strong for the next few days," I told them quietly. "Your father is leaving for Seattle, and it's going to feel weird. But I promise you, we're going to be okay. Better than okay." Lucas, always the logical one, asked, "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" At 11, he deserved honesty. "Probably yes," I said. "But that's between your father and me. What matters is that you 3 are loved, secure, and your lives here don't have to change unless you want them to." Sunday night, David's last night in our house, he was too excited to notice the tension. Over dinner, he talked about his first week schedule, the projects he'd be leading, the opportunities for advancement. The kids were subdued, pushing food around their plates. After they went to bed, David and I sat on the couch, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the partnership we'd once had. "Are you scared?" I asked him. He looked surprised. "Of the new job? Nah, I'm ready for this. It's the next level, you know?" I meant about being away from us, I clarified. He shrugged. It's only temporary. You guys will be out there before I know it, and this will all be worth it. That was when I realized he genuinely didn't understand what he'd done wrong, didn't see how his unilateral decision had broken something fundamental. He saw himself as a provider making a smart career move, not as a husband who'd forgotten to value his partner's voice. Monday morning arrived with the cold clarity of February in Ohio. David loaded his 2 suitcases into his car, hugged the kids goodbye, and told them he'd video call every night. Sophie cried, Lucas held it together stoically, and Emma hugged him tight but said nothing. When it was my turn, David pulled me close and whispered, "Thank you for being so amazing about this. I know it's a big change, but we're going to love Seattle." I kissed his cheek, smiled, and said, "Safe travels, David. I hope you find everything you're looking for." He pulled out of the driveway at 6 a.m. for his noon flight, waving cheerfully. I stood on the porch with my coffee, watching his taillights disappear, and felt something like freedom settle over my shoulders. At 9 a.m., I called my office and accepted the director position, starting in 2 weeks. At 10 a.m., I sent the kids to school with extra hugs and promises that everything would be okay. At 11 a.m., I met with Jennifer Novak to sign the final papers. At 2 p.m., while David was somewhere over the Midwest, a process server in Seattle received his assignment to deliver divorce papers to David's new apartment the following day. By 5 p.m., when the kids came home from school, I had already started repainting the guest room that would become my home office, the space where I'd build the career I'd sacrificed for 15 years. David called that night from his new apartment, full of energy about the city, the company, the fresh start. The kids talked to him briefly, their enthusiasm forced and fragile. When it was my turn, he asked how the house selling was going. "Actually," I said calmly, "I've decided we're not selling the house. The kids and I are staying in Ohio." The silence on the other end stretched for 5, 10, 15 seconds. "What do you mean, staying?" His voice had gone flat, careful. "I mean exactly what I said. You made a unilateral decision to move across the country. I'm making a unilateral decision to stay. Seems fair, don't you think?" I could hear him breathing, processing. "Becca, this isn't funny. We talked about this. You agreed." "No, David. You talked. I listened. I never agreed. I just didn't argue because I knew it wouldn't matter. You'd already decided, just like you always decide." His tone shifted to conciliatory, the voice he used when he wanted to smooth things over. "Look, I know this is a big adjustment, but once you get here, you'll see how great it is. The schools are amazing, the opportunities. I'm not coming, David. And tomorrow, you'll be served with divorce papers." The words hung in the air like smoke. "You're what?" His voice cracked between confusion and anger. "I filed for divorce this morning. You should receive the papers tomorrow. I'm keeping the house and primary custody of the kids. You can visit them here or they can visit you during summers and holidays, but we're done pretending this is a partnership when you treat it like a dictatorship." The explosion I expected came immediately, his voice rising in volume and pitch, words like, "crazy," and "overreacting," and "you can't do this," tumbling over each other. I let him vent for a minute before calmly responding, "Actually, David, I can. And I am. Enjoy Seattle. We'll handle the rest through our attorneys." I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline but my resolve solid as steel. The phone immediately started ringing again, David calling back, probably ready to deploy every manipulation tactic he'd ever used. I sent it to voicemail. Then I walked into the living room where the kids were pretending to do homework but obviously listening. "Your father knows now," I said simply. "It's going to be hard for a while, but we're going to be okay." "Better than okay." Emma looked up from her biology textbook, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something like respect in her teenage eyes. "Mom," she said quietly, "I'm proud of you." That moment, more than anything else, confirmed I'd made the right choice. The next 24 hours were chaos contained within the walls of our home. David called 17 times, left 11 voicemails ranging from apologetic to furious, and sent a barrage of texts that evolved from confusion to blame to desperate bargaining. I responded to none of them, following Jennifer's advice to let all communication flow through attorneys once papers were served. Tuesday afternoon, I received confirmation from the process server. David had been served at his new apartment at 3:47 p.m. Pacific Time. 20 minutes later, my phone exploded with calls from his mother, his brother, and 2 of his colleagues who somehow got dragged into this mess. I blocked the colleagues immediately and sent his family members a brief text. This is between David and me. Please respect our privacy during this difficult time. What David didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything for 2 years, ever since the startup investment incident when he'd withdrawn $40,000 from our joint savings without discussion. I'd started keeping a journal then, noting every time he made a major decision without input, every time he dismissed my concerns, every time he prioritized his career advancement over family discussion. Jennifer had been thrilled when I showed her the journal during our first meeting. This establishes a clear pattern of unilateral decision-making and financial control, she'd said, flipping through pages of dated entries. Combined with the marriage counseling notes from Dr. Hayes about this exact issue, we have documentation that this isn't a sudden reaction to one incident, but a response to years of behavior. Wednesday morning, David's attorney called Jennifer. She briefed me afterward with barely concealed satisfaction in her voice. He wants to negotiate. Apparently, he told his lawyer you'd had a temporary breakdown due to stress and just needed time to calm down. I corrected that misunderstanding immediately. I could imagine David's face when his attorney explained that I was completely serious, fully prepared, and had been planning this for weeks. What's he offering? I asked. Joint custody with the kids splitting time between Ohio and Seattle, sale of the marital home with equal division of proceeds, and spousal support for only 2 years to help you transition back to work. Jennifer's tone made it clear what she thought of that offer. I'm assuming we're countering? Aggressively, she confirmed. Primary physical custody with you, him getting standard visitation, you keeping the house with him buying out his equity over time, and spousal support for 7 years, half the length of the marriage, to account for your career sacrifice. The kids were adjusting to the new reality in different ways. Emma had become almost protective, checking on me throughout the day, making sure I was eating, even offering to make dinner some nights. Lucas retreated into his robotics projects, building increasingly complex machines in the garage as his way of processing the change. Sophie, at 8 years old, struggled the most. She'd ask when Daddy was coming home, if he still loved her, if it was her fault. Those questions broke my heart more than anything David had done. I'd sit with her in her pink bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals, and explain over and over that Daddy loved her very much, that grown-up relationships were complicated, that none of this was her fault. Sometimes, I told her, holding her tight, people who love each other can't live together anymore. But that doesn't change how much we both love you. My parents, retired and living 10 minutes away, became my unexpected support system. My mother, who'd always liked David, was furious when she learned the full story. He did what? She'd said when I told her about the job acceptance. Without even discussing it with you first? After everything you've sacrificed? My father, quieter but equally angry, offered to help with the kids' schedules, driving them to activities, being present for school events. You focus on getting yourself settled, he told me. We've got the grandkids covered. Their support was a lifeline I hadn't known I'd needed, proof that I'd been right to stay in Ohio where we had roots, community, family who actually showed up. Thursday brought an unexpected complication. David's mother, Patricia, showed up at our door unannounced. I considered not answering, but the kids had already seen her car in the driveway. I opened the door to find her tight-lipped and clearly prepared for battle. Rebecca, we need to talk about what you're doing to my son. I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me so the kids wouldn't hear. Patricia, with respect, what I'm doing is responding to what your son did to me and our children. He accepted a job 2,000 miles away without a single conversation with his family. She waved her hand dismissively. David is providing for his family. Men have to make tough career decisions sometimes. The casual sexism of that statement shouldn't have surprised me. Patricia had always been a stand by your man type, but it still landed like a slap. Patricia, I've stood by David for 15 years. I put my career on hold 3 times for our children. I've managed our household, our schedules, our entire family life while he advanced his career. But partnership means making major life decisions together, and David forgot that partnership includes my voice. Patricia's expression hardened. So you're punishing him by keeping his children away from him? That's cruel, Rebecca. I felt my own anger rising, the polite facade I'd maintained cracking slightly. I'm not keeping them away. He can visit anytime, and they'll visit him during breaks. What I'm not doing is uprooting 3 children from their schools, their friends, their grandparents, and their entire support system because he decided unilaterally that we should. If that feels like punishment to you, perhaps you should ask yourself why you raised a son who thinks his wife's input is optional. Patricia left shortly after, but not before warning me that I was making a mistake, that David would fight this, that I'd regret destroying our family over one disagreement. I watched her drive away and wondered how many women of her generation had swallowed their own dreams and desires in the name of supporting their husbands' ambitions, how much quiet resentment they'd internalized and normalized. I refused to model that for my daughter. Emma deserved to see that women's voices mattered, that partnership was real, that you didn't have to shrink yourself to accommodate someone else's growth. Friday afternoon, I started my new job orientation. The marketing firm had changed significantly since I'd left, but the core work I'd loved was still there: strategy, creative campaigns, building brands that resonated with real people. My new boss, Catherine Montgomery, was the director who'd fought to create this position specifically for me. "We've missed your perspective," she told me during a welcome lunch. "The creative team has gotten too comfortable. You're going to shake things up." For the first time in years, I felt seen for something beyond my role as David's wife or the kids' mother. I was Rebecca Sterling, marketing director, bringing 15 years of life experience and a fresh hunger to prove myself. That evening, David called the house phone, which I'd forgotten to block. Sophie answered before I could intercept, her little voice lighting up. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" I walked into the kitchen to find her chattering about school, her art project, her best friend's birthday party. When she finally handed me the phone, her expression falling as she remembered we weren't all going to Seattle, David's voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "Becca, we need to talk like adults about this." I kept my voice level, aware Sophie was listening. "We can talk through our attorneys, David. That's what they're for. I'm not discussing our marriage with lawyers," he snapped. "You're my wife, was your wife," I corrected gently. "That ended when you decided to move across the country without me having a vote in the matter." The conversation deteriorated from there, David cycling through anger, bargaining, and confusion. He couldn't seem to grasp that I wasn't negotiating, wasn't looking for compromise, wasn't going to be convinced that his way was best if he just explained it better. "You're being irrational," he finally said, the familiar refrain he'd used throughout our marriage whenever I disagreed with him. "You're angry right now, but when you calm down." "I am calm," I interrupted. "Probably the calmest I've been in years. I'm just done, David. Done being treated like my opinions are suggestions you can ignore. Done putting my life on hold for yours. Done pretending that what we had was partnership when it was actually just you making decisions and me implementing them." The silence that followed was broken only by his breathing, heavy and harsh. "I never meant for it to be like that," he said finally, and for the first time, I heard something like genuine confusion in his voice, as if he honestly couldn't see how we'd gotten here. "I know you didn't," I said, and meant it. David wasn't malicious, just oblivious, so focused on his own trajectory that he'd stopped seeing the people around him as separate individuals with their own needs and dreams. But intent doesn't erase impact. You may not have meant to make me feel invisible, but I felt invisible anyway. And I'm done feeling that way. We ended the call shortly after, and I stood in my kitchen, in my house, in my town, feeling the rightness of this decision settle into my bones. The kids were upstairs, my parents were 10 minutes away, my new job started Monday, and for the first time in 15 years, I was building a life on my own terms. Saturday brought an unexpected gift. My college roommate, Maya, called to check in after hearing through the gossip network about my separation. "I saw David's Seattle job announcement on LinkedIn," she said. "How are you holding up?" I filled her in on everything, and her response was immediate and fierce. "Good for you. Do you remember sophomore year when I stayed with that boyfriend who chose his summer internship in New York without asking if I wanted to do long distance? I did remember, Maya had spent the whole summer miserable, then dumped him the day he got back. You told me then that anyone who made major life decisions without me wasn't worth waiting for. I should have listened. You're listening to your own advice now, and I'm so proud of you. We talked for over an hour, Maya filling me in on her life, her career as a commercial photographer, her recent divorce from a man who'd had similar tendencies to make unilateral decisions. It's like they think being the primary earner means being the primary decision maker, she said. Like our contributions don't count because they can't be measured in a paycheck. She'd hit on something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. David had always seen himself as the provider, the one making sacrifices at work to support the family, and had somehow translated that into believing his career took precedence over everything else. My unpaid labor, the emotional work, the household management, the child rearing, didn't register as equally valuable in his calculation. Sunday, I took the kids to my parents' house for dinner, a weekly tradition we'd maintained throughout my marriage. My father grilled burgers while the kids played in the backyard, and my mother sat with me on the deck, her expression thoughtful. Your father and I have been talking, she said carefully. We want you to know we support you completely, but we also want to make sure you've thought this through. Divorce is hard, especially on children. I appreciated the concern even as I bristled slightly at the implication I hadn't considered every angle. Mom, I've thought about nothing else for 2 years. I documented, I tried counseling, I communicated my feelings clearly. David made a unilateral choice that showed me nothing had changed. What am I teaching the kids if I accept being treated as an afterthought? My mother nodded slowly, reaching over to squeeze my hand. You're right. I just needed to hear you say it. Your father and I, we come from a generation where you stayed no matter what. But watching you these past few days, seeing you stand up for yourself, I realized that maybe our way wasn't always the best way. That admission, from a woman who'd been married for 42 years, meant more than she probably knew. You and Dad have a real partnership, I told her. I've seen him consult you on everything from job offers to paint colors. That's what I wanted with David, and what I never got. I'm not throwing away a good marriage, I'm escaping a one-sided one. That night, after tucking the kids into bed, I sat in my home office surrounded by moving boxes that David had ordered weeks ago, expecting me to pack up our lives. Instead, I was unpacking them, filling the shelves with my marketing books, my old portfolio, the parts of myself I'd boxed up to make room for his ambitions. My laptop dinged with an email from David's attorney, a formal response to our custody and support proposal. Jennifer would review it Monday, but I scanned it quickly, noting the aggressive tone, the characterization of my demands as unreasonable, the suggestion that my refusal to move constituted parental alienation. Let them make those arguments in court. I had 15 years of receipts showing exactly who'd been the present, engaged parent while David climbed the corporate ladder. Monday morning, I walked into my new office with the confidence of someone who'd reclaimed their life. The team welcomed me warmly, Catherine giving me a tour and introducing me to colleagues who remembered me from my previous stint at the firm. Rebecca used to run our most creative campaigns before she left to focus on family, Catherine told the group. Now she's back, and we're lucky to have her. That simple acknowledgement of my professional identity separate from my identity as David's wife or the kid's mother felt revolutionary. I dove into work with enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years, reviewing campaigns, offering feedback, contributing ideas in brainstorming sessions. This was who I'd been before marriage and motherhood, and discovering she still existed underneath all those years of domestic labor was like finding a treasure I'd thought lost forever. That evening, Jennifer called with news. David's attorney is playing hardball, characterizing you as unstable and claiming the sudden move to Seattle was necessitated by his job, not a choice. They're arguing that keeping the kids in Ohio is punishing him for professional advancement. I felt anger flare but kept my voice steady. And our response? We're filing an emergency motion to establish temporary custody arrangements that keep the kids here during the school year. We'll also submit all the documentation showing his pattern of unilateral decision-making, including the marriage counseling notes. Judge Morrison is assigned to the case. She's fair but doesn't tolerate parental manipulation. I think we're in good shape. What David hadn't counted on was my network. While he'd been building his career in Seattle, I'd been building something equally valuable in Ohio: relationships. The kids' teachers, their coaches, our neighbors, my parents' friends, people who'd watched me show up consistently for 15 years while David traveled for work or stayed late at the office. When Jennifer began gathering character references for our custody hearing, she was overwhelmed by the response. Emma's principal wrote about my involvement in the parent-teacher organization and my volunteer work in the library. Lucas's robotics coach detailed how I'd never missed a competition, even learning about circuitry to better support his interests. Sophie's second-grade teacher described my regular classroom volunteer sessions. Separately, each reference was nice. Together, they painted a picture of a parent deeply embedded in her children's lives and community, the kind of parent who deserved to maintain that stability. By the end of my second week at the new job, I'd already contributed to a pitch that won us a major client. Catherine pulled me aside after the presentation. "This is exactly why I fought for this position. You've still got it, Rebecca. Actually, you've got more than you had before. There's a depth to your perspective now, an understanding of real people's lives that makes your campaigns authentic." That compliment meant everything. Validation that the 15 years I'd spent focused on family hadn't erased my professional capabilities, just added to them. I was building something for myself again, and it felt like breathing after being underwater. The preliminary custody hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. David made one more attempt at direct communication, calling late one Tuesday night when he knew I'd be awake. "Becca, please, can we just talk without lawyers for 5 minutes?" His voice was tired, stripped of anger or bargaining, just exhaustion. Against my better judgment, I agreed to listen. "I'm not trying to be a villain here," he said. "I thought I was making a good decision for all of us. Better salary, better opportunities, a fresh start. I honestly didn't think you'd react like this." That was the problem, I realized. He didn't think. He didn't consider how his decisions impacted anyone else because he'd never had to. I'd always adjusted, always accommodated, always made it work. "David," I said carefully, "imagine if I'd accepted a job in California without mentioning it to you, then announced we were moving in 6 weeks. How would you feel?" The silence stretched long enough that I thought he might have hung up. "I'd be angry," he finally admitted. "I'd feel like my opinion didn't matter." "Exactly. Now imagine I'd done that after you'd put your career on hold for 15 years to raise our kids, manage our household, and support my professional growth. Imagine I'd done it after we'd been to counseling specifically about me making decisions without your input. Would you move to California?" Another long pause. "Probably not," he said quietly. "Then you understand why I'm not moving to Seattle. The difference is I'm not asking you to give up your new job. I'm just asking you to recognize that your choices have consequences, and one of those consequences is that your children are staying in Ohio with me." We didn't resolve anything on that call, but something shifted slightly. David seemed to be starting to grasp that this wasn't a tantrum he could wait out or a negotiation he could win through persistence. I was serious, prepared, and I had every legal and moral right to keep our children in the stable environment they'd known their entire lives. When we hung up, I felt something like sadness for the marriage we might have had if David had ever truly seen me as an equal partner rather than a supporting character in his story. But that sadness was clean, not desperate. I mourned the potential, not the reality. The reality had needed to end. The next 2 weeks brought an unexpected development that both validated my decision and complicated the custody situation. David's new boss, Robert Chen, called me directly. A breach of attorney protocol that should have set off alarm bells but instead offered crucial insight. "Mrs. Sterling, I apologize for the intrusion," he began, his voice professional but uncomfortable. "I'm calling because I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about David's position here in Seattle." My hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Robert cleared his throat. "The position David accepted was never meant to be permanent. It's a 6-month project-based contract with possibility of extension, not the permanent senior role he may have described. I assumed his family understood this was temporary when he accepted. 6 months. Project-based. Possibility of extension." Each word landed like a hammer blow, revealing another layer to David's deception. "Mr. Chen, my husband told me this was a permanent position with substantial advancement opportunities." He moved across the country and expected his entire family to follow for what you're describing as a temporary contract? Robert's sigh was audible. I'm realizing now that David may have misrepresented the situation. I wanted to reach out because he's been making comments about his family arriving soon, and I thought you should know what you'd be moving for. After thanking him and hanging up, I immediately called Jennifer. This changed everything. Jennifer's response was immediate and fierce. He uprooted your entire family dynamic for a 6-month contract? Does he even have a guaranteed position after that? We both knew the answer. David had gambled everything on a temporary opportunity, betting that his performance would lead to permanent placement, and had been willing to sacrifice his family's stability on that gamble without even disclosing the risk. This is exactly what we need, Jennifer said, already strategizing. It demonstrates reckless decision-making and a willingness to destabilize the children's lives for uncertain professional gain. Judge Morrison is going to have a field day with this. I told the kids that night, keeping it age-appropriate but honest. Your father's new job is actually temporary, just for 6 months. He wasn't completely truthful about that. Emma's face hardened with an anger I recognized from my own reflection. So he wanted us to move across the country, leave everything behind, for maybe 6 months? Lucas, always logical, asked the practical question. What happens after 6 months if they don't keep him? And Sophie, sweet 8-year-old Sophie, said the most devastating thing of all. Is Daddy lying to us? How do you explain to your child that their father isn't malicious, just so convinced of his own narrative that he'd reshaped reality to fit it? The custody hearing arrived on a cold March morning. David flew back to Ohio, staying at a hotel near the courthouse. I hadn't seen him in 6 weeks, and when he walked into the courtroom, I barely recognized him. He'd lost weight, his suit hung slightly loose, and his face held a gauntness that suggested sleepless nights and skipped meals. Part of me felt a flicker of sympathy, quickly extinguished when I remembered why we were here. He'd made his choices. Now he'd live with the consequences. Judge Morrison was a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and reading glasses that she peered over when listening to arguments. She'd reviewed all our submitted documentation, my journal, the counseling notes, the character references, and the new revelation about the temporary nature of David's position. David's attorney went first, painting me as a vindictive spouse preventing a father from his children, someone who couldn't handle change and was weaponizing the kids against their father. Mr. Sterling made a professional decision that many parents make, the attorney argued. Relocating for work is common and doesn't constitute abandonment or neglect. His wife's refusal to even consider the move shows inflexibility and a concerning willingness to deprive the children of a relationship with their father. I sat still, hands folded, knowing Jennifer would dismantle that argument systematically. And she did. Jennifer stood, her posture radiating controlled confidence, and began laying out the reality David had tried to obscure. Your Honor, this isn't about a father making a professional decision. This is about a pattern of unilateral decision-making spanning 15 years, documented in marriage counseling notes from 3 years ago addressing this exact issue. Mrs. Sterling put her career on hold 3 times to raise their children while Mr. Sterling advanced professionally. During that time, they established a home, a community, and stability for their children. Then Mr. Sterling accepted what he claimed was a permanent position across the country, without discussing it with his wife, without considering his children's input, without even informing them of the interview process. He simply announced the family would move in 6 weeks. Judge Morrison's expression remained neutral, but she made notes as Jennifer continued. Further, we've recently learned that this permanent position is actually a 6-month contract with no guarantee of extension. Mr. Sterling was willing to uproot 3 children from their schools, their friends, their grandparents, and their entire support system for a temporary opportunity he misrepresented to everyone, including apparently his own employer's expectations about family relocation. This demonstrates not just poor communication with his spouse, but reckless decision-making that prioritizes his ambitions over his children's stability. The hearing lasted 3 hours, with both sides presenting evidence and calling witnesses. My father testified about being actively involved in the grandchildren's lives, driving them to activities, attending school events. Catherine from my job testified about my professional capabilities and reliable work ethic. Emma's principal spoke about the disruption that a mid-year move would cause, particularly for a freshman navigating critical high school transitions. But the most powerful moment came when Judge Morrison asked to speak with the children privately in her chambers, with only a court-appointed guardian ad litem present. I waited in the hallway with Jennifer while David paced near the courtroom doors, his attorney speaking quietly to him. When the kids emerged 20 minutes later, Emma looked relieved, Lucas looked drained, and Sophie was clutching the guardian's hand tightly. The guardian, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Patricia Hayes, approached both attorneys. "I'll be filing my recommendations with the court by end of week, but I can tell you the children have made their preferences very clear." David's face went white. He knew, as I knew, that children's preferences weren't determinative but carried significant weight, especially for the older two. Judge Morrison took a 15-minute recess before delivering her preliminary ruling, and those 15 minutes felt eternal. I sat with Jennifer in a side room, trying to steady my breathing, trying to prepare myself for any outcome. "You've done everything right," Jennifer reminded me. "Strong documentation, stable home environment, community support, and the children's clear preference to stay. Morrison would need a compelling reason to disrupt that." When we reconvened, Judge Morrison looked directly at David before speaking, and I knew from her expression which way this would go. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice measured but firm, "I've reviewed the extensive documentation in this case, heard testimony from multiple witnesses, and spoken privately with your children. What I see is a pattern of unilateral decision-making that culminated in accepting a temporary position across the country without proper communication with your family. Your argument that this was a standard professional relocation doesn't hold up against the evidence showing you misrepresented both the permanence of the position and consulted with your wife on this major life decision." David's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. "Furthermore, your children have made clear their preference to remain in Ohio, where they have established lives, strong relationships with maternal grandparents, academic and social commitments, and a stable home environment with their mother who has been their primary caregiver." Judge Morrison's ruling was everything Jennifer had hoped for. Primary physical custody to me, with David getting standard visitation, alternating weekends when he was in Ohio, extended summer visits, alternating holidays. He was responsible for all travel costs for the children's visits to Seattle, and he was prohibited from relocating them without court approval and demonstrated stability in any future position. Spousal support was set at 60% of the difference in our incomes for 7 years, accounting for my career sacrifice. The house remained mine, with David's equity to be paid out over time from the spousal support. It was a complete validation of everything I'd argued, and across the courtroom, I watched David's face crumble as the reality of his choices crashed down on him. After the ruling, David approached me in the hallway, his attorney having disappeared to file paperwork. "Becca," he started, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "I never meant for any of this to happen." I looked at this man I'd been married to for 15 years, the father of my children, and felt nothing but a sad resignation. "I know you didn't. But David, intent doesn't erase impact. You made choices that showed me where I ranked in your priorities, and it wasn't high enough. I hope Seattle works out for you. I genuinely do. But we're done pretending this is something it never was." I walked away without looking back, collecting my children and my parents and heading out into the pale March sunshine, free. The next few weeks were an adjustment period as we all adapted to the new normal. David called the kids regularly, the conversations awkward and stilted as they navigated this changed relationship. He flew back twice for weekend visits, taking them to museums and restaurants, trying to compress quality time into 48-hour bursts. The kids came home from these visits emotionally drained, and I resisted the urge to probe for details, simply being available when they wanted to talk. Emma started seeing a therapist to process her anger at her father, her confusion about the divorce, her resentment at being put in this position. Lucas channeled everything into his robotics, winning a regional competition and barely acknowledging when I called David to share the news. Sophie regressed slightly, nightmares and bedwetting returning after a year of being past those phases, her 8-year-old mind struggling to understand why her family had fractured. My career flourished in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Catherine promoted me to senior director after just 2 months when I landed a campaign that increased our biggest client's market share by 18%. "You're on fire," she told me during my performance review. "Whatever was holding you back before, it's gone now." She was right. Without the constant mental load of managing David's ego, anticipating his reactions, adjusting my ambitions to accommodate his, I had energy and focus I'd forgotten existed. I took on challenging projects, mentored junior staff, and rediscovered the professional identity I'd shelved for motherhood. The difference was now I didn't have to choose one or the other. I could be both professional and mother, without a partner who saw those roles as competing rather than complementary. My parents became even more integral to our daily lives, picking up kids when I worked late, hosting Sunday dinners that felt more relaxed without David's presence, offering the kind of stable grandparent relationship that enriched my children's lives in ways I'd undervalued before. My mother and I grew closer, having adult conversations about marriage, sacrifice, and identity that we'd never had when I was trying to maintain the fiction of a happy partnership. "I'm proud of you," she told me one evening while washing dishes after dinner. "I know I questioned your decision initially, but watching you rebuild, seeing the kids adjust, I realize you made the brave choice. Staying would have been easier. Leaving took real courage." David's 6-month contract in Seattle was not extended. I heard through his brother that the company had liked his work but didn't have budget for a permanent position, and David was scrambling to find something else on the West Coast rather than admit defeat by returning to Ohio. Part of me felt vindicated. His gamble had failed exactly as I'd predicted. Another part felt sad for him, watching him chase something he couldn't quite define while losing what he'd actually had. He eventually found a position in Portland, still on the West Coast but a step down from what he'd left in Ohio, and settled into a studio apartment with furniture from IKEA, a far cry from the family home he'd abandoned. The children's relationship with their father evolved into something different but sustainable. Emma maintained emotional distance, video calls polite but cool, unwilling to forgive his choices that had turned her freshman year into chaos. Lucas was more practical, accepting the situation and focusing on his own interests, treating David's calls like obligations to check off rather than connections to nurture. Sophie, youngest and most adaptable, seemed to adjust best, accepting David's absence as her new normal, though she still asked occasionally why he couldn't just move back to Ohio. I never badmouthed David to them, never tried to poison their relationship with their father, but I also didn't pretend his choices hadn't had consequences. They deserved honesty about what had happened, age-appropriate but real. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I went on my first date since the separation. His name was Marcus Fletcher, a colleague from a sister company who'd asked me out after a joint presentation at a marketing conference. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been since my early 20s, worried about whether I still knew how to do this, whether I was ready, whether bringing someone new into the kids' lives was fair. But Marcus was patient, understanding, willing to move at whatever pace I needed. We went to dinner, talked about everything except my divorce, and I felt like Rebecca again, not David's ex-wife or the kid's mother, just myself. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. By summer, our new life had found its rhythm. I'd adjusted my work schedule to maintain flexibility for the kids, earned enough that money wasn't the constant stress it had been in the early months, and built a social circle that included other divorced parents navigating similar waters. Emma was thriving in her sophomore year, plans already forming for college visits. Lucas's robotics team qualified for nationals. Sophie had stopped having nightmares, her teacher reporting she seemed happier, more settled. The kids flew to Portland for 2 weeks in July to stay with David, and while they came back with stories about their father's small apartment and his new job, they also came back relieved to be home, in their rooms, in their lives. What surprised me most about the post-divorce reality was how much lighter I felt. I'd expected guilt, regret, second-guessing about whether I'd made the right choice. Instead, I felt like someone who'd finally put down a heavy weight they'd been carrying for years. Making decisions without having to consider how David would react, building a life based on what I and the kids needed rather than what accommodated his ambitions, rediscovering professional competence I'd thought was gone, all of it contributed to a sense of rightness that confirmed what I'd known that Tuesday night over tacos. Some marriages deserve fighting for. Ours had needed ending. 14 months after David moved to Seattle, he showed up at our door unannounced on a Friday evening in October. The kids were upstairs finishing homework when the doorbell rang, and I opened it to find him standing on our porch, looking thinner and older than when I'd seen him at the custody hearing. "Becca," he said, and his voice carried an exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "Can we talk? Please. Just 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me to give the kids time to process his unexpected presence if they'd heard his voice. "I lost the Portland job," he said without preamble. "Budget cuts, last hired first fired. I've been applying everywhere, but nothing's landing. I'm staying in a hotel right now because I can't afford the apartment anymore." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from our marriage when he was stressed. "I'm coming back to Ohio. I wanted you to know before I told the kids." The irony of him asking my permission now, after everything, wasn't lost on me. "What are you planning to do here?" I asked carefully. "Where will you stay? Do you have a job lined up?" He shook his head. "I'm staying with my brother temporarily. I've got some interviews in Cleveland and Columbus. I'll figure it out." I studied this man who'd once been my partner, seeing clearly now what I'd missed during our marriage, the pattern of jumping without a plan, assuming everything would work out because it always had before, operating on optimism rather than strategy. "David, you can't just show up in the kids' lives without stability. They've adjusted to you being gone. If you come back and then leave again when you find another job somewhere else, it'll hurt them more than your absence did." His face tightened. "They're my children too, Becca. I have a right to be in their lives." "You have a right to visitation according to our custody agreement," I corrected. "You don't have a right to disrupt their stability because your plan didn't work out." The conversation escalated quickly, David's exhaustion morphing into familiar defensiveness. "You're still punishing me for one mistake," he accused. "I made a bad career move, and you're using it to keep me from my kids." I felt the old anger flare, the frustration of being misunderstood so fundamentally that correction seemed pointless. "David, you didn't make one mistake. You made a pattern of choices that showed you valued your ambitions over your family's input. Moving to Seattle was just the final evidence of something I'd been seeing for years. And I'm not keeping you from the kids, you can see them according to the schedule. But I won't let you create chaos in their lives because you didn't plan beyond your next career opportunity." He left without seeing the kids that night, angry and resentful, and I went back inside to find Emma standing at the top of the stairs, having clearly heard everything. "Was that Dad?" she asked, her expression unreadable. When I nodded, she said, "Good that you didn't let him in. He doesn't get to just show up when it's convenient for him after leaving when it was convenient for him." My 14-year-old daughter's clear-eyed assessment of her father would have broken my heart if I didn't agree with her. Lucas appeared behind her, asking what the noise was about, and I gathered both of them and Sophie to explain that their father had moved back to Ohio but was going through some difficulties and we'd need to be patient about visits. David's return to Ohio complicated our settled routine in ways I hadn't anticipated. He exercised his visitation rights aggressively, picking up the kids every other weekend even though he was staying in his brother's spare room and couldn't really provide them appropriate space or activities. The kids came back from these visits reporting that David spent most of the time on his laptop job hunting while they watched TV or played on their devices. "It's weird being there," Lucas told me after one particularly awkward weekend. "Uncle Jake is nice, but it's not like Dad has his own place. We just sit around feeling like we're in the way." My work continued to flourish, and Catherine pulled me aside one Monday morning with unexpected news. "Corporate is creating a VP of marketing position for the Great Lakes region," she said. "I recommended you. It's a significant promotion, substantial salary increase, but it would mean occasional travel and managing teams across 3 states. The opportunity was exactly what I'd been working toward, validation that my professional instincts and capabilities were valuable. But it also meant more responsibility, less flexibility, and I'd need to consider how it impacted the kids. "Can I have a few days to think it over?" I asked, and Catherine nodded. "Of course. But Rebecca, you've more than earned this. Don't let fear of change make you turn it down." That evening, I sat the kids down and explained the opportunity, asking for their input in a way David never had. It would mean some weeks where I travel for a day or two, staying overnight in Cleveland or Detroit. Grandma and Grandpa would pick you up from school and stay here with you. You'd also get to be proud that your mom is kicking butt at her job. I smiled at Sophie, who giggled at the mild language. Emma surprised me by saying, "Take it, Mom. You gave up your career for us for years. We can handle you traveling sometimes." Lucas agreed, adding that Grandma made better grilled cheese anyway. Even Sophie, after some reassurance that I'd always come back, gave her blessing. Their support, freely given because they'd been asked, reinforced everything I'd been fighting for. Partnership, even with children, meant giving people a voice. I accepted the VP position, and my first official act was restructuring my team to include more work-from-home flexibility for parents on staff, using my own experience to inform better policies. The move was noticed at the corporate level, earning praise for innovation and employee retention strategies. Meanwhile, David continued scrambling for employment, his LinkedIn profile updated with increasingly desperate frequency. I felt no satisfaction in his struggle, just a weary observation that his lack of planning had led inevitably to this precarious position. When he finally landed a position in Akron, a lateral move at best from what he'd had in Ohio before Seattle, he called to tell me with a tone that expected congratulations. I offered neutral acknowledgement and reminded him to update the court with his new address and income for child support calculations. The most significant shift came 6 months after David's return when he started dating someone he'd met through work. Her name was Jennifer Morris, and from what the kids reported, she was nice enough, younger than both of us, no children of her own, apparently charmed by David's version of our divorce story. Emma came home from a visit rolling her eyes. "Dad told Jennifer you couldn't handle his career success and that's why you divorced him. Like he's the victim in this whole thing." The revision of history didn't surprise me, but it still stung that David couldn't take responsibility even in private. "What did you say?" I asked Emma. She shrugged. "I told her Dad moved across the country without telling any of us and that you divorced him for being selfish." She got really quiet after that. Marcus, who I'd been seeing for nearly a year at this point, had met the kids gradually, carefully, never pushing for more space in our lives than I was ready to give. He was patient with Sophie's initial shyness, engaged Lucas in conversations about robotics even though he knew nothing about the subject, and respected Emma's protective skepticism without taking it personally. When I told him about David's new relationship, Marcus asked thoughtfully, "How do you feel about it?" I considered the question honestly. Relieved, maybe? If he's focused on someone new, he's less likely to focus on resenting me. And the kids need to see that life moves forward after divorce for both parents. David's relationship with Jennifer progressed quickly, too quickly, in my opinion, but I kept that thought to myself. Within 6 months, they'd moved in together, and David started bringing her to pick up and drop off exchanges, clearly wanting me to see that he'd moved on. I was polite but distant, having no interest in developing any relationship beyond cordial co-parenting civility. Jennifer seemed uncomfortable with these interactions, perhaps sensing the tension beneath our superficial pleasantries, or perhaps having heard enough from David to see me as the villain in his story. Either way, I found myself grateful for the emotional distance divorce had created. Their relationship wasn't my concern as long as it didn't negatively impact my children. The real crisis came just before Christmas, 2 years after our divorce was finalized. David called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I need to talk to you about something important. Can we meet?" We arranged to meet at a coffee shop the next morning, neutral territory where we could have a difficult conversation without the kids overhearing. When David arrived, he looked haggard, and I felt a flicker of concern despite our history. "What's wrong?" I asked directly, and he didn't waste time with preamble. "Jennifer is pregnant. We're getting married next month." My first thought was for my children, how they'd process this news, what it would mean for their relationship with their father to have a new sibling on the way. "How do the kids feel about this?" I asked, and David's expression told me he hadn't told them yet. "I wanted to talk to you first, figure out how to tell them." The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't so sad. Now he wanted to communicate, to plan together, to consider impact before announcing life-changing decisions. "They need to hear it from you directly," I said. "All 3 of them, together, so they can process it as a unit and support each other. And David, you need to reassure them that a new baby doesn't change your love for them." Watching David navigate this new development, I found myself oddly detached from any emotional response beyond concern for my children's well-being. His life was moving forward in a direction that had nothing to do with me, and I was genuinely okay with that. My own life had found a rhythm that felt sustainable and fulfilling, challenging work I was good at, kids who were thriving despite the divorce, a relationship with Marcus that was growing at a pace that felt right for both of us. I didn't need David to fail for me to succeed, didn't need him to be miserable for me to be happy. I just needed him to be a decent father to the children we shared, and that was becoming increasingly complicated. The kids' reactions to David's news varied predictably. Emma was angry, feeling like her father was replacing them with a new family. Lucas was more pragmatic, asking practical questions about how much time David would have for them once the baby arrived. Sophie, now 10 and still the most resilient, seemed excited about being a big sister, until Emma pointed out that it would be their half-sibling, living primarily with Dad and Jennifer, not part of their daily lives. The distinction hadn't occurred to Sophie, and watching her face fall as she processed the reality of their fractured family structure broke my heart all over again. David got married in a small ceremony in January that the kids attended, but I didn't, maintaining appropriate boundaries as the ex-wife who'd moved on. They came home with stories about the wedding, how pretty Jennifer looked, how nervous Dad seemed, how weird it was watching him marry someone who wasn't me. I listened, validated their feelings, and gently reminded them that people's lives change and that didn't mean the past hadn't mattered. But privately, I wondered if David had learned anything from our divorce, or if he was simply repeating the same patterns with someone new who didn't know yet to question his unilateral decision-making. Marcus and I had conversations about our own future, about whether we wanted to blend our lives more permanently. He'd been married before, had 2 kids of his own who lived with their mother in another state, and understood the complications of second relationships with children involved. "I'm not in a rush," he told me one evening as we sat on my porch after the kids were asleep. "We're building something good here. Let's not force it to be more than what it naturally becomes." That patience, that willingness to let our relationship develop without pressure or artificial timelines, was everything my marriage to David hadn't been. We were partners in the truest sense, consulting each other on decisions, respecting each other's boundaries, building something together rather than one person dragging the other along. The turning point came 3 years after our divorce, just after David's daughter was born. He called me from the hospital, exhaustion and something like awe in his voice. "Her name is Lily. She's 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and she's perfect." I congratulated him genuinely, asked about Jennifer's health, and asked when our kids could visit their new half-sister. "Tomorrow, if that's okay. I want them to meet her." There was a vulnerability in his voice I hadn't heard in years, and I wondered if fatherhood the second time around, fully present for pregnancy and birth in ways he'd delegated to me with our children, had given him new perspective on what he'd missed before. The kids met Lily the next day, and their reports were mixed. Emma held her but seemed distant, unable to fully embrace this new sibling who represented their father's new family. Lucas was interested in a clinical way, asking about newborn development and feeding schedules. Sophie was smitten, holding Lily with the tenderness of a child who desperately wanted to be needed, who saw this baby as a chance to be the protective older sibling she'd never gotten to be. Watching Sophie's face light up while talking about Lily, I felt the complicated tangle of emotions that co-parenting brings, happiness for her joy, sadness that it came from a family structure separate from our own, and resignation that this was our new normal. But David's presence in our kids' lives remained inconsistent. The new baby demanded time and attention, and his visits with Emma, Lucas, and Sophie became less frequent, more perfunctory. Phone calls were rushed, cut short by Lily crying in the background or Jennifer needing help. The kids noticed, and their resentment grew. "He has a whole new family now," Emma said bitterly one evening when David canceled their weekend visit for the 3rd time in 2 months. "We're just the old family he's obligated to deal with." I couldn't argue with her assessment because it matched what I observed. David was repeating familiar patterns, hyper-focused on what was new and exciting, treating his existing responsibilities as burdens rather than blessings. My relationship with Marcus deepened into something neither of us had expected to find again. He proposed on a quiet Saturday morning in my kitchen, no grand gesture or dramatic staging, just a simple question while we made pancakes for the kids. I know we said we weren't rushing, but I can't imagine my life without you in it. Will you marry me? I said yes without hesitation, feeling none of the doubt or pressure that had characterized my first marriage. We told the kids together over breakfast, and their reactions ranged from Sophie's excited squealing to Lucas's thoughtful nod to Emma's careful, "Are you sure about this, Mom?" We set a date for the following summer, giving everyone time to adjust, and I made clear that I wanted the kids involved in planning, their input valued in this decision that would reshape our family structure. David's reaction to news of my engagement was harder to read. When I told him during a custody exchange, his face went through several expressions before landing on something like grudging acceptance. "I hope he treats you better than I did," he said quietly, and for a moment, I saw genuine self-awareness in his eyes. "You deserve that." It was the closest he'd come to apologizing, and I accepted it for what it was: acknowledgement without excuses, awareness of failure without demands for forgiveness. "Thank you," I replied. "I hope you've learned from our mistakes too. Lily deserves a father who's present and considerate, not just providing." The wedding planning became an unexpected source of healing for our fractured family. Emma helped choose flowers, Lucas designed the ceremony program with robotics precision formatting, and Sophie insisted on being a junior bridesmaid with very specific ideas about her dress. Marcus's kids flew in for the wedding, blending our families for the weekend in ways that felt organic rather than forced. David attended with Jennifer and Lily, sitting in the back rows, and I felt nothing seeing him there except mild appreciation that he was supporting the kids by being present for their mother's happy day. My vows to Marcus were everything my vows to David hadn't been: promises made with full awareness of what I was committing to, partnership acknowledged and celebrated, individual identity maintained while creating something larger together. "I promise to always ask your opinion on major decisions," I said, looking directly into Marcus's eyes. "I promise to see you as an equal partner in all things. I promise that when we disagree, we'll discuss it rather than one of us declaring decisions unilaterally. I promise to value your dreams as much as my own." Those promises, shaped by the failure of my first marriage, created the foundation for a second marriage that felt completely different from the start. Life settled into a new rhythm with Marcus as part of our daily existence. He moved into our house, the kids adjusting to having a stepfather who consulted them about everything from paint colors to vacation plans. His respectful approach to parenting, always deferring to me on major decisions about my kids while building genuine relationships with them individually, created space for the family to blend without forcing it. Emma gradually warmed to him, especially after he helped her with college application essays without judgment or pressure. Lucas and Marcus bonded over fixing things around the house, Marcus teaching him basic carpentry and electrical work. Sophie claimed him as her favorite person to watch Disney movies with, their Sunday afternoon tradition that neither took for granted. David's life took a downturn when Jennifer left him 2 years after Lily's birth. The divorce was bitter, with Jennifer claiming he'd been emotionally absent, more focused on work than family, unwilling to compromise on decisions that affected all of them. The accusations were so familiar they could have been copied from my own divorce papers, and I felt a grim validation that I hadn't been the problem. David's patterns ran deeper than any individual relationship. He called me late one night after the divorce was final, drunk and maudlin, slurring apologies for how he'd treated me, for not appreciating what we'd had, for destroying our family over a job that hadn't even lasted 6 months. I listened without offering absolution, recognizing that he needed to voice his regrets, but I didn't need to tell him it was okay. It wasn't okay. It never would be okay. But it was in the past. Jennifer got primary custody of Lily with David having standard visitation, an ironic mirror of our own custody arrangement. He now had 2 families he saw on alternating weekends, 2 sets of children who felt like obligations rather than joys, and the growing realization that his choices had created this fragmented existence. Emma, now in college studying psychology, came home one Thanksgiving and told me she'd been processing her childhood in therapy. "My therapist asked me what I learned from watching your divorce," she said. I told her I learned that staying in a bad situation to avoid change usually just makes the change harder when it inevitably comes. "You were brave, Mom. I see that now." My career continued ascending, and Catherine retired, recommending me as her replacement as director of marketing for the entire firm. The promotion came with significant responsibility, substantial compensation, and the opportunity to implement family-friendly policies across all departments. I used my platform to advocate for parental leave, flexible scheduling, and workplace culture that valued employees' whole lives, not just their productivity. The work was fulfilling in ways that went beyond professional accomplishment. I was creating change that would benefit others navigating the same work-life balance challenges I'd faced. Lucas got accepted into MIT for engineering, and we celebrated with a family dinner where everyone who'd supported us through the divorce years gathered: my parents, Marcus and his kids, my colleagues who'd become friends, and yes, even David, who attended awkwardly but seemed genuinely proud of his son. Watching Lucas give his graduation speech about resilience and adaptation, thanking both his parents for teaching him that sometimes the biggest challenges lead to the best growth, I felt the full arc of our journey from that Tuesday night taco dinner to this moment of triumph. Sophie, now a teenager herself, navigated her relationship with David with the wisdom of someone who'd learned early that people showed their priorities through actions, not words. She maintained connection with him but without the desperate need for approval that had characterized Emma's younger years. "Dad is who he is," she told me once with a shrug that belied her 13 years. "I love him, but I don't expect him to change. You can't change people. You can only decide how much space to give them in your life." That mature assessment from my youngest child confirmed that our fractured family had somehow managed to raise emotionally intelligent humans despite, or perhaps because of, the divorce. David remarried again, to a woman named Patricia who seemed kind but cautious, clearly aware of his 2 previous divorces and approaching the relationship with appropriate skepticism. I met her briefly at Lucas's graduation and found myself hoping, for David's sake and for the sake of all the children involved in his complicated family tree, that he'd finally learned to be a partner rather than a dictator. But I wasn't invested in his growth anymore. He was the father of my children, worthy of basic respect and cordial co-parenting, but his personal journey was his own to navigate. The most unexpected development came when David's mother Patricia reached out 5 years after our divorce, asking to meet for coffee. I was hesitant, remembering her complete support of David during our divorce, but curiosity won out. We met at the same coffee shop where David had told me about his Seattle job, and Patricia looked older, frailer, diminished in ways that suggested health struggles. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "I defended David blindly during your divorce, blamed you for not being supportive. But watching him make the same mistakes again with Jennifer, seeing him struggle with the consequences of his choices, I realize you were right. He needed to be held accountable, not enabled." Patricia's apology opened a door I hadn't known was closed. We developed a tentative relationship based on our shared love for Emma, Lucas, and Sophie, and her desire to be a better grandmother than she'd been during the turbulent divorce years. She attended school events, sent birthday cards, made effort to connect with the kids individually. It wasn't full reconciliation, too much had been said and done for that, but it was healing nonetheless. She'd chosen to acknowledge her mistakes, to grow from them, to build something better going forward. It was more than David had managed. 10 years after that Tuesday night taco dinner, I stood in my backyard during a summer barbecue, surrounded by the life I'd built from the rubble of my first marriage. Marcus manned the grill while chatting with my father about baseball. My mother helped Sophie set the picnic table. Emma was home from graduate school, bringing her serious boyfriend to meet the family. Lucas video called from MIT, his face on a tablet propped on the table so he could be part of the celebration. Friends I'd made through work, through the kids' activities, through the single-parent support group I'd joined years ago, filled the yard with laughter and conversation. David arrived late with Patricia and Lily, who was now a precocious 7-year-old who looked disturbingly like Sophie had at that age. I watched him interact with his scattered family, his older children polite but distant, his youngest eager for attention he only partially provided, his mother watching him with sad understanding of his limitations. He caught my eye across the yard, raised his beer in a small salute, and I returned the gesture. We'd created this strange extended family through the destruction of our marriage, and while it would never be simple or easy, it worked well enough. Marcus appeared beside me, sliding an arm around my waist. "Thinking deep thoughts?" he asked, and I leaned into his solid presence. "Just reflecting on how far we've come." 10 years ago, I was terrified and hurt and convinced I'd destroyed my children's lives by divorcing their father. Look at them now. We watched Emma laugh at something Sophie said, watched Lucas's pixelated face grin from the screen, watched Lily show my mother a dance she'd learned. You didn't destroy anything, Marcus said firmly. You rebuilt. There's a difference. Later, after guests had left and the kids were upstairs in their rooms, I sat on my porch with Marcus, the summer night warm and full of promise. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Divorcing David, I mean. Look at all the complications it created. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the custody battles, the financial stress of those early years, the kids' struggles to adjust, the judgment from people who thought I should have tried harder to make it work. Not for a second, I answered honestly. That marriage was killing parts of me I needed to survive. Yes, divorce was hard. But staying would have been harder. And look what we built instead: actual partnership, kids who understand healthy relationships, careers that fulfill us, lives that feel authentic. I'd choose this complexity over that simplicity every time. The final validation came on a crisp October morning 12 years after the divorce, when Emma called from her therapy practice in Chicago with news that made everything worthwhile. Mom, I'm getting married, she announced, her voice bubbling with excitement. His name is James, and he's wonderful, and I'm so happy. We talked for an hour about her fiancé, a social worker she'd met through professional circles, and I heard in her descriptions everything I'd hoped my daughter would find: respect, partnership, shared values, genuine collaboration. The thing I love most about James, she said toward the end of our call, is that he asks my opinion on everything. Like, everything. What apartment to rent, what furniture to buy, whether to adopt a dog. He genuinely wants my input because he values my perspective. That's what partnership looks like, I told her, my heart full. That's what I wanted you to see modeled, even if I had to destroy my own marriage to show you what not to accept. Emma was quiet for a moment. I used to be so angry at you for divorcing Dad. I blamed you for breaking up our family. But watching you build this life with Marcus, seeing how he treats you with actual respect, understanding that Dad made the same mistakes with Jennifer that he made with you, I get it now. You didn't break up our family. You saved yourself, and in doing that, you taught me what to demand for myself. So thank you, Mom, for being brave enough to leave. Lucas graduated from MIT with multiple job offers, accepting a position with a robotics firm that allowed him to work remotely from wherever he wanted. He chose to stay in Boston, building a life separate from both his father's chaos and my rebuilt stability, forging his own path with the independence we'd all needed to develop. He video called regularly, shared his successes and struggles with equal openness, and had somehow emerged from our fractured family as the most well-adjusted of my children. I think watching you and Dad divorce taught me to be self-reliant, he told me during one call. I learned early not to count on anyone else to make my life work. I had to figure it out myself. Sophie, my baby who'd struggled most with the early divorce years, thrived in high school as captain of the debate team, president of student council, and recipient of early acceptance to Northwestern. She'd developed David's ambition but paired it with my communication skills, creating a formidable combination. I want to be a family lawyer, she announced during her senior year. Help other kids whose parents are divorcing navigate the system better than we had to. The idea that my youngest child had transformed her childhood trauma into professional purpose moved me beyond words. She'd taken the hardest thing she'd experienced and decided to make it meaningful. David's life had stabilized into something sustainable if not particularly happy. His third marriage to Patricia lasted, primarily because she'd insisted on couples counseling from the start and refused to tolerate the unilateral decision-making that had destroyed his previous marriages. He had a decent job in Cleveland, a modest house in the suburbs, and relationships with all 4 of his children that were cordial if not particularly close. Lily, now a teenager, spent alternating weekends with him just like Emma, Lucas, and Sophie had, and from what the kids reported, David was a better father to her than he'd been to them, perhaps learning finally from repeated failures what he'd refused to learn the first time. The relationship between David and me evolved into something almost friendly, the acrimony of our divorce years mellowing into mutual respect for the separate lives we'd built. We could sit together at Emma's wedding, making small talk about the kids, laughing at old memories that had lost their sharp edges with time. You were right, he told me during the reception, after several drinks had loosened his usual guardedness. About Seattle, about everything. I was so focused on my own ambitions that I couldn't see I was destroying what actually mattered. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure that out. I accepted his apology with grace, recognizing it for what it was, an admission that came too late to change the past but might inform his future. Marcus and I celebrated our 10th anniversary with a trip to Ireland, just the two of us, our blended family stable enough now that the kids could manage without us for 2 weeks. Walking through the Irish countryside, hand in hand with a man who'd never once made a major decision without consulting me, I felt profound gratitude for the life I'd built. Not the life I'd planned when I married David at 23, but something better, more authentic, more aligned with who I actually was rather than who I'd tried to be. My career had topped out at the highest level I'd aspired to, Chief Marketing Officer for our parent company, overseeing strategy across multiple brands and mentoring the next generation of marketing leaders. I'd used my platform to advocate for working parents, for flexible arrangements, for policies that acknowledged employees had lives outside work that deserved protection and respect. You're the kind of leader I wish I'd had when my kids were young, one of my mentees told me after I'd approved her request to work from home 3 days a week. Someone who remembers what it's like to juggle everything and doesn't penalize people for having families. The most unexpected gift came when Patricia, David's mother, became ill with cancer. In her final months, she asked to see me, and I visited her in hospice, sitting beside her bed while she struggled to breathe. "Thank you for not turning the children against their father," she whispered, her voice thin and raspy. "You could have. You had every right to. But you gave them space to have their own relationship with him, and that's more generous than he deserved." I held her frail hand, this woman who'd once blamed me for destroying her son's life, and felt the full circle of our complicated relationship. "They needed to know their father," I said simply. "Whatever our problems were, he's still their dad." Emma's wedding was everything mine to David hadn't been. A celebration of partnership, of two people choosing each other with full awareness and intention, surrounded by family and friends who supported their union without reservation. I watched my daughter exchange vows with James, promising to respect each other's voices, to make major decisions together, to build a life based on equality and mutual consideration, and I knew my own painful journey had been worth it to model for her what to demand in a partner. During the mother-daughter dance, Emma whispered in my ear, "This is what you deserved, Mom." I'm glad you eventually found it. Lucas brought a serious girlfriend to Thanksgiving that year, a fellow engineer named Priya who matched his intensity and intelligence. Over pumpkin pie, he told the gathered family, me and Marcus, Emma and James, Sophie and her new boyfriend, even David and Patricia and Lily, that he and Priya were moving to California for a startup opportunity. "I wanted to tell everyone together," he said, looking pointedly at David, "because that's what you do when you respect the people in your life. You include them in major decisions. You give them time to process and ask questions. You don't just announce and expect everyone to comply." The message was unmistakable, and David had the grace to look ashamed. Sophie's college years flew past, and she graduated with honors, law school acceptance in hand. At her graduation party, she pulled me aside. "I need to tell you something I've never said. When you and Dad divorced, I was so young I didn't really understand what was happening. I just knew my family was different from my friends' families, and I blamed you for that. But watching Dad with Lily, seeing him make the same mistakes, realizing that you protected us by leaving rather than staying in something that was slowly destroying you, Mom, you're my hero. You showed me that women don't have to accept whatever life hands them. We can choose differently. We can demand better." That lesson shaped everything about who I became. The years continued their steady march, bringing grandchildren from Emma and eventually Lucas, career accolades and retirement plans, health scares survived and holidays celebrated. David remained a peripheral figure in our lives, present for major events, involved enough with his children to maintain relationships, but never achieving the closeness he'd forfeited through years of prioritizing wrong things. Lily grew up with 3 half-siblings who included her in family events with the generosity of children who'd learned early that family came in complicated configurations. She'd call me occasionally, asking advice about her father, and I'd try to be honest without being cruel, helping her understand his limitations while protecting her relationship with him. Marcus and I grew old together in the graceful way of couples who'd found each other later, appreciating every day as a gift rather than an obligation. We'd sit on the porch of our home, the same house David had expected me to sell 12 years earlier, watching grandchildren play in the yard, marveling at how life had unfolded so differently from what either of us had planned. "Do you think you'd have been as happy if you'd never married David?" Marcus asked me once, genuinely curious rather than insecure. I considered the question seriously. "I don't think so. Not because David made me happy, he didn't, not really. But because failing at that marriage taught me what I actually needed to thrive. If I'd married someone like you first, I might have taken it for granted. Living through what didn't work helped me recognize and appreciate what does." On the 15th anniversary of that Tuesday night taco dinner, I gathered my children and their families for a celebration that had nothing to do with David but everything to do with what we'd built from the rubble of his decision. Emma was there with James and their 2 daughters. Lucas flew in from San Francisco with Priya and their son. Sophie brought her law school friends, young women she mentored the way I'd mentored her. We sat around my dining table, extended now to accommodate the growing family, and I looked at these remarkable humans who'd emerged from chaos stronger, wiser, more resilient. "I want to make a toast," I said, raising my glass. 15 years ago, your father told me we were moving to Seattle in 6 weeks. He'd accepted a job without discussing it with any of us, and he expected me to comply the way I always had. I said yes initially, because that's what I'd always done. But then I realized, I had a choice. I could follow blindly, teach you that your voices don't matter, model that partnership means one person decides and everyone else accommodates. Or I could choose differently. I could show you that when someone doesn't respect your input, you can walk away. That decision led to hard years, painful adjustments, complicated family dynamics. But it also led to this: authentic relationships, real partnership, lives built on solid foundations. So here's to choosing yourself. To demanding respect. To building something real rather than settling for something convenient. To family, however we define it. The room erupted in agreement, glasses clinking, voices overlapping with affirmations and additions to the toast. Even Marcus's kids, who'd become genuinely integrated into our blended family, raised their glasses in support. And outside, through the dining room window, I saw David's car pull up for a brief visit with Lily. He'd texted asking to stop by, and I'd agreed because that's what co-parents did: maintained civility, facilitated relationships, put children's needs ahead of old grievances. When he came inside, Lily running ahead to greet her half-siblings, David paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, the full table, the laughter, the obvious warmth and connection. His expression held something like wistfulness mixed with regret, and I felt a moment of compassion for this man who'd lost so much by valuing the wrong things. "You built something good here, Becca," he said quietly, and I heard genuine acknowledgement in his voice. "Better than what we had. I'm glad. The kids deserved this." I nodded, accepting his words as the peace offering they were. They deserved parents who respected each other and themselves. We gave them 1 out of 2, which is better than nothing. As the evening wound down, children departing to their own homes and lives, Marcus and I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, our comfortable rhythm perfected by years of partnership. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, handing me a plate to dry. I smiled, considering how to articulate the profound contentment I felt. "I'm just thinking about how scared I was that night 15 years ago. Terrified of being alone, of failing as a mother, of making the wrong choice. And I did all those things. I was alone for a while, I made mistakes as a parent, some of my choices probably were wrong. But I also built this." I gestured to the house around us, evidence of a life well lived. "And that was right. Choosing myself was right." Marcus kissed my forehead, his love evident in the simple gesture. "Best choice you ever made." "Well, second best." After agreeing to marry me, I laughed, swatting him with the dish towel, and felt the lightness that came from living authentically. The journey from that Tuesday night to this moment had been long and often painful, but I wouldn't change any of it. Every hard decision, every tear shed, every moment of doubt had led to this peace, this certainty, this joy. David left that night alone, returning to his third wife and complicated life, while I remained in the home I'd fought to keep, surrounded by family built on choice and respect rather than obligation. Our paths had diverged that Tuesday night, and while his remained chaotic and uncertain, mine had led somewhere solid. Not perfect, life never is, but authentic, genuine, and wholly mine. And that made all the difference.